Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and good morning to you all. I'm Cecilia Friedman-Levin, Senior Policy Counsel at ASISTA, and I am delighted to be with you all today for the Alliance for Immigrant Survivors webinar on updates on asylum policy and talking about its impact on survivors. Our presenters today are Archie Piatti, who is the Chief of Policy at the Tahirih Justice Center, and Ann Dutton, who is the Equal Justice Works Emerson Fellow at the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies. Welcome to you both. So a few housekeeping issues before we get started, and I'll turn things over to Archie. Just want you to remember that this is a webinar about policy updates. So it's not about kind of individual cases or an asylum one-on-one, but we will provide resources to you at the end of the webinar for those types of cases. Also, for logistics, please use the chat box for any reason whatsoever. If you can't hear us, if you'd like us to repeat something, a question on the content, we will try to get to as many questions as possible in our time together. But if we unfortunately don't get to yours, then if you have anything that you would like to follow up with us on, then please do reach out to us at info@immigrantsurvivors.org, and I will put that email address in the chat box so that you have it handy. And lastly, as you can see in the chat box already, we do have captioning available for this webinar, so that you can click on the link and open up the window for GoToWebinar, and also for the captioning service, so you can have that simultaneously during the course of today's presentation. And lastly, just a reminder to you all today that this webinar is for information purposes only, and it is not for media attribution. And now I would like to turn things over to Archie. Thanks, Archie.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. My name is Archie, and I work at the Tahirih Justice Center. Tahirih is a nonprofit organization that's been open for more than 20 years now. We provide legal and social services to immigrants who are fleeing gender-based violence. We operate out of 5 locations across the country and also do policy advocacy here out of our national office. And Anne, would you like to introduce your organization?
Sure, thanks Archie. So I'm here from the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, and CGRS is a nonprofit based in San Francisco dedicated to advancing protections for refugees. And we engage in strategic litigation, policy advocacy, and we also have an extensive program providing technical assistance to attorneys representing asylum seekers around the country.
Excellent. So we are assisted here on this webinar by Yin, and so I'm going to ask Yin to please advance to the next slide. Thank you, Yin. So let's get started and talk about our goals for this webinar. We are here today to define first, really briefly, just the mission and the goals of the Alliance for Immigrant Survivors, called AIS. We're relatively new as a group, and so we'd like to give you a little information about who we are. We'll also go over some recent policy changes that impact survivors of violence seeking an asylum. As a reminder, you may have seen in the announcement, this is not an Asylum 101 training. Some of those have been offered in the past, and we may offer that in the future, but for now we wanted to give you a kind of breaking news update on some policy changes. So we'll be happy to answer more specific questions via email or in the question box as we go along. We'd also like to give you an update on some current litigation to protect asylum for survivors, and also offer just a few practical tips toward the end on supporting survivors seeking asylum. So I'll cover the policy updates, and we'll cover the litigation updates, and we'll be happy to take your questions at the end. Yin, could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So again, Alliance for Immigrant Survivors, just wanted to highlight with this slide that there are 4 co-chair organizations. They are API GBV, ASISTA, Casa de Esperanza, and the Tahirih Justice Center. Next slide, please. The AIS mission, pretty simply, is we're a network of advocates, and our main focus is making sure that immigrant survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking, and other gender-based abuses have access to life-saving protections that all survivors of violence deserve. Next slide, please. We co-chair the four organizations that I mentioned a minute ago. We're the co-chairs of the Immigration Subcommittee of the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. Now, some of you may know the NTF well. The NTF is really comprised of hundreds of domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy organizations from around the country. The NTF leads policy advocacy as well in DC on federal issues, but also around the country on state issues and other things. There's a steering committee of the NTF made up of just a few dozen organizations, and within that there's an immigration subcommittee. So for those of you who have further questions about immigration issues related to survivors in particular, or immigrant survivors and their rights, the AIS email address, which you'll see at the end of this slide presentation and that Cecilia announced at the beginning, is your go-to source for information. Next slide, please. Our work at AIS is really focused on building a network of advocates. Our goal is to provide that network with tools and resources. We want to be sure that all AIS members know about the effects of immigration policies on survivors' ability to access protections and services. We also are looking at immigration-related policies and trying to figure out what the impact might be. Sometimes it's not entirely clear when we look at immigration-related policies, well, that might affect immigrants in one way or another, but how is that specifically going to impact survivors? So we spend a good bit of time doing that analysis. We also look at laws and policies that impact survivors more generally and see how that impacts immigrant survivors in particular. And then finally, we use communication strategies to try to positively influence the public narrative about survivors and about immigrant survivors in particular. Next slide, please. So today we're going, now that you know a little bit about AIS, AIS together decided that it felt like time for us to do a webinar in particular on recent asylum policy changes. Many of you have joined today, which tells us that we weren't wrong. It is a good time to be talking about asylum. We've seen in the news now for a couple years just a barrage of reporting of all types, of all sorts, on TV, in movies, in documentaries, also in what's going on every single day in the headlines. Everyone, it seems to be talking about immigration, talking about the border, and talking about asylum. But we know that as advocates for survivors of gender-based violence, you are in particular looking for information about not just what's in the news and what's everybody buzzing about, but really what are the actual changes afoot so that you can do your work to support survivors in your day-to-day practice and have the information at your fingertips. So our goal today is to get that information to you. And again, we're happy to take questions in the chat box as well as, and we'll be trying to answer those throughout as well as at the end. And then you can reach out to us individually with specific case questions and other things like that. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. Now, I wanted to use this slide, which is actually a graphic that was created by the Department of Homeland Security, just to share with you a little bit about what asylum is and where it fits in. So there are a number of different forms of immigration relief or pathways to immigration status that victims of gender-based violence might be eligible for under United States law. You can see these are the T visa, VAWA, U visa. There's something called continued presence, the SIJ, which is special immigrant juvenile status, and asylum. So we have done and will continue to do education through webinars and other things on all of these remedies so that you are very familiar with how somebody can qualify for these types of relief and what happens if they do qualify but aren't able to get it, how to advocate for themselves and how you can help advocate for them and that type of thing. But today we're going to focus on asylum. I wanted to be sure to bring to everyone's attention that asylum is a legal form of relief. It is prescribed under the law. Actually, the definition of who qualifies for asylum comes from international law. In fact, right after World War II, after the Holocaust, the United States was part of drafting an international treaty that defined who a refugee is. The United States took that definition and dropped it into our domestic immigration law, and decided, you could be a refugee if you were, we would use that definition to name you a refugee if you were requesting that outside of the United States. But if you're in the United States and you're asking for protection, you can apply for what is called asylum. It's essentially a very similar, the same definition in the statute, but we'll explain a little more today what exactly applying for asylum looks like and how it's changing. But some of the basic elements, just so you know, are that if you're applying for asylum, what you're trying to convince your adjudicator, who could be Department of Homeland Security or an immigration judge, you're trying to convince that adjudicator that you meet the definition of a refugee under the Immigration and Nationality Act. That definition includes you have to be somebody who is outside of your country of nationality. You have to fear something called persecution. You have to fear persecution that is going to happen to you or has happened to you on account of your race, religion, political opinion, nationality, or social group. And what those things actually mean and how they get applied is a matter of legal practice. It's been developed over many years now through litigation, and we're not going to get into the details of what those mean today. That persecution has to have been perpetrated, or you're afraid it's going to be perpetrated, by your government or by somebody the government cannot or will not control. So you hear that I didn't mention gender when I named these 5 grounds. Gender-based claims have been made for many, many years now, for over 20 years. And gender-based claims have been made based on many different factors, including social group, political opinion, religion. We'll learn more from Anne in just a few minutes about eligibility and what eligibility looks like and how that's been changing. I just want to make sure everyone on this webinar knows that this is a legal process. Coming to the United States and asking for asylum, as you can see, the Department of Homeland Security itself has it on its website. It is a legal process. It is completely legal to come here and ask for asylum. There's a very clear set of regulations, there's statute, and there's also a long history of case law that helps us know who qualifies and who might not. And it's constantly evolving, and we'll talk more about that. Next slide, please. Thank you, Yane. So I'd like to touch just for a minute on asylum policy in recent history. And I only have one slide on this, and obviously I'm talking about many, many years. So this is severely reduced. But what I wanted to give you a sense of is that, what's hot, what's in the news, what these changes or recent policy changes are reacting to is migration. Really specifically, we're talking about migration from Central America to the United States and people asking for protection from Central America. That migration pattern is not brand new. So you'll hear words like crisis used and things like that, but it has been predictable for many years, and it has been ongoing. Since about 2011, we've seen a very steady increase, little by little. At times it's actually dropped, and at other times increased a little bit more than that. But generally, it has been a steady increase since then. The reason for that steady increase has been really since the 1970s. The total number of border crossers now is really at some of its lowest numbers since the 1970s, but the steady increase since 2011 is related to Central American women and children and families in particular migrating here. It's not as much single individuals as it is families, women, and children coming to the United States because parents are trying very hard to protect their children. Women are fleeing sexual assault and domestic violence. Members of the LGBT community are fleeing harassment, persecution, attacks. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that some Central American countries are among, right now, the most dangerous in the world, especially when it comes to gender-based violence. Now, why are they the most dangerous in the world? It really has to do with structural and governmental problems that have left vulnerable groups even more susceptible to unchecked violence that has made it very dangerous to be a girl, be a woman, be a young person, and to be able to protect yourself in that environment. And so, again, very predictably, people trying to save their lives have come to the United States border, migrating hundreds of miles, often on foot, to try to get to safety. So that's what we've seen. But, you know, as the Obama administration saw these increased numbers, especially peaking around 2014, their response was manifold, and I've only listed a few examples here. But there was a change in the credible fear screening standard. That's the standard that's applied in a screening interview that happens at the border. There was the initiation of long-term family detention, which was stated as a deterrence mechanism, trying to keep families from coming to the U.S. by promising them long jail terms in the United States as families, putting kids in jail. And there were children being held in what were called, you know, temporary shelters, but really were camps on military bases. And so the situation was pretty dire, even under the Obama administration. By the end of the administration, some of the responses had somewhat improved. Some new programs have been started, like a family case management system. Some shelters have been put in place, and the Department of Health and Human Services was given additional resources to help look after children, unaccompanied children in particular, who were crossing the border. So some things were becoming more humane toward the end of that administration, but rest assured that nothing was perfect, and we were not, I do not in particular look back at that time with rose-colored glasses. Next slide, please. Fast forward, however, to the election at the end of 2016 and the new administration that came into power in 2017, and we see a very different picture. So we had some real return to normal migration flows, and yet we start hearing pretty serious language about how we have a migration crisis and a border crisis. We also see pretty rapid fire. Even though in those first 6 months of the Trump administration, numbers went down, we saw significant changes in policy. Some executive orders came out. We also saw cancellation of humanitarian programs like the family case management system. We saw an increase in detention and deportation of families, individuals, even people with pending cases in some, not necessarily asylum cases, but pending cases of different kinds. We saw the zero tolerance policy, you may remember from the spring of 2018, come into effect, where border crossers of any type, even if they had expressed a fear of return and were interested in applying for asylum, were being prosecuted, criminally prosecuted. That was pretty unheard of. It has been, it is possible to prosecute asylum seekers and prosecute border crossers, but typically in our history, every administration, whether Republican or Democrat, had looked at the actual risk and the actual benefit of prosecuting, as well as the financial cost to taxpayers and the drain on resources that it presents for prosecutors who need to be really prosecuting violent crime and prosecuting crime that is a threat to us. Prior administrations had decided not to put federal prosecution resources into prosecuting asylum seekers for crossing the border. And yet in this administration at the end of, in the spring of last year, we saw the initiation of the zero tolerance policy. One of the things that led to, in addition to the increase in detention, was the practice of family separation. Family separation meant that mothers and their children were separated, fathers and their children were separated, entire joint family units were being pulled apart. We still don't even really know what the complete number of families were who were separated. There were some numbers offered in the beginning. It appeared after a while that tracking had not been complete. And later we learned that in fact many families were separated, but because of the background or the status of the parents and the children, the separation had not been tracked adequately. So as an example, one of Tahere's clients, Vilma, who's represented through our Atlanta office, was in a situation like this. So she came to the United States with her young daughter to apply for asylum and asked for protection at the border. She was detained, Vilma, the mother, and prosecuted Now, Vilma is a survivor of domestic violence and suffered severe abuse in her home country. The story, we have much about her story on our website. I don't need to take time with that now, but she, suffice it to say, her abuse was severe, and she certainly, we believe, has a colorable claim for asylum, if not clearly merits asylum. She applied, wanted to apply, expressed her desire to apply, was prosecuted and detained and separated from her daughter. She was taken, her young daughter was taken away from her. Vilma was moved to Georgia. Her daughter was kept in Arizona. They had very little ability to communicate with each other. And when, after national outcry, press got involved, the public got involved, everyone was activated over the summer to try to get families reunited. Many families were being reunited, and after litigation, a court ordered the administration to reunite families. Vilma was actually taken from her detention center in Georgia to go reunite with her daughter, but then officials realized her daughter was actually a U.S. citizen because she had been born here on on Vilma's prior trip to the United States. And so after being born here, she was a United citizen. So her daughter had actually been taken to foster care and not into DHS custody. And so that family separation then didn't fall under the legal case. And so DHS would not reunite Vilma with her child. There are many cases like that out there where DHS is not tracking the children separated from the parents in the same way. And so we're very worried and concerned about additional moms and children who've been separated. Thankfully, after a sustained campaign by organizations like yours, by many other advocates across the country, reporting in the media, and other litigation like a habeas petition, Vilma was finally released, and this is a picture on the right of her reuniting with her daughter just a few weeks ago. Next slide, please. Another part of the recent policy changes that I thought was worth sharing with you and making sure there's clarity on is this idea of caravans, or a caravan that was moving in the fall through Mexico, coming from Central America. And again, now this word caravan has resurfaced. So sometimes, in order to make the very perilous journey where vulnerabilities abound for families and children, traffickers can take advantage. It's a very dangerous journey. Families and individuals will come together and try to journey together. Even when they're traveling in groups, small or large, for protection and for safety and to stay organized and to, be a community, they don't necessarily present a different kind of risk, and they don't necessarily present different numbers in terms of overall migration numbers or patterns. They simply may be staying together due to a need to stay safe. And so this is what we saw in the fall. You may remember that there was significant rhetoric in coming from the administration, some of it getting reported and amplified by media, about danger and dangerousness and threats of the traveling group of migrants, also about who might be, what types of people, categorizing people who might be traveling together as if we should be afraid of them or as if they were traveling in mobs. And this was very dangerous for us as a society, as a nation, and for the American public, but also very dangerous for immigrants in the United States who have already been living, in many cases, in a climate of fear since the executive orders and since this administration came into power in 2018. So, that climate of fear can have a very significant impact on survivors, in particular, survivors of violence living in our communities, who need to feel comfortable calling 911 to be able to get protection when rhetoric like this, whether it's about immigrants in the United States or immigrants traveling to the United States to get protection, can be very dangerous for them as they seek protection. They may not call 911, they may not get to safety, and then they and their children may be left in abusive situations because abusers know if the victim is too afraid to call 911, then they can continue their acts with impunity. So we as AIS, as providers of services and as advocates for immigrant survivors here in the United States, we're concerned about this rhetoric, partly because of the policy implications it ended up having at the border, but also because of our concern for immigrants and immigrant survivors in particular already living in the United States. So talking about those groups traveling to the United States in the late fall, a few notes here. Some of the reaction seemed really out of step and unnecessary for the families who were coming here. What ended up happening was that many of the ports of entry at the southern border closed, and if they weren't closed, a new practice called metering began, where only a few asylum seekers or individuals who wished to ask about their rights and ask about their ability to claim asylum were allowed to come to the port of entry per day. And that practice means that people are waiting for a very long time, and the conditions in which they're waiting may not be healthy or safe. So you can see here in this picture, this is an aerial view of a sort of makeshift tent city that was put up in a stadium in Tijuana, where a lot of migrating families and individuals were encamped in order to wait for their opportunity to speak with U.S. officials. Volunteers were there to help, both from the Mexican side as well as from the American side. American attorneys and advocates were traveling down there to try to provide information, including Tahrir attorneys. But what we learned, what we saw and what we learned were really awful. We saw there were heavy rains and the waters would flood. The sanitation was not good. People were coughing relentlessly. People were becoming sick. We actually know about mothers and children who were very afraid of armed guards there. These are trauma survivors who'd experienced violence, and it's not healthy for their mental health for them to be around that kind of potential violence either. We also encountered one woman who actually had fled her abuser and come to a waiting facility, but then come to wait at the border to ask for asylum. But actually she was located by a family member of her abuser and was actually assaulted while waiting to cross the border. So we know, and she was Central American, had made the perilous journey for so many miles, to come to safety, only to find that she couldn't flee and couldn't get protection quickly enough. So this is to say, the fall reaction to the quote-unquote caravan was definitely inadequate, and advocates like Tahrir and others were very upset about the treatment that migrating families and asylum seekers met. Next slide, please. Really around the same time, we saw something called the asylum ban come into effect, or actually be announced. It was a proclamation and a proposed rule. It would have prevented anyone crossing the border between ports of entry from being eligible for asylum at all. So just removing the option of asylum at all for individuals simply based on where they crossed. Now keep in mind, ports of entry were being closed on and off, and entry was metered. So, logically, there was not much other choice for an individual or a family that felt the need to come across to safety. If this were to come into full effect, it would impact about 70,000 people per year. Thankfully, litigation was filed very quickly, and a California federal court, put a stop to it. And the attempted end run around that by the administration did not succeed in front of the Supreme Court. And so the proposed rule that was filed was open for public comments until early January. Hundreds of groups filed. Just a plug here for those of you who may be asking yourself, what can we do? Often when these kinds of public rules are issued or proposed rules are issued, the public has opportunity for comment. We at AIS and at Tahrir, but specifically AIS, sent out action alerts, and we'll continue to do that, inviting you to file comments. And we create model comments that you can use as a basis to create your own comment. Filing those comments can be very, very advantageous. The more comments that are filed, the better. So in the future, please do watch out for us asking you to file comments or to join comments being filed by other organizations. For now, the asylum ban is on hold. Let me go to the next slide, please. I'm coming close to the end of my portion, so just for those of you who are eager to hear more about the legal landscape at the moment, Anne will be up in just a few moments. I'd like to turn it over to her so she has ample time to explain. Really briefly, although the asylum ban is on hold, we have a new policy now for just a few days that was announced just recently, just last week, called Remain in Mexico. That's what advocates are calling it. And it requires that all asylum seekers wait in Mexico while their claims are pending. It's being piloted right now at the San Isidro port of entry and will roll out everywhere, we assume, shortly. There are a number of questions yet unanswered about it. How will hearings be conducted? How will people on the other side in Mexico be able to access legal counsel? But we're guessing and making some pretty strong assumptions, I think, some pretty likely assumptions about what the problems with this are, in addition to being just, clearly not in line with what was envisioned by the international treaty that I mentioned at the beginning, that requires us to provide an opportunity for individuals to seek safe haven here. It clearly violates that. It also, we think goes against a number of other domestic legal provisions that should allow people to apply for asylum in this country, not to mention the Constitution and the idea of due process. But we're very worried about some specific impacts on survivors of violence who might be in Mexico waiting to make their claims. One is they may not be able to get legal counsel, and we know that's a primary factor in winning asylum. We also know that for people filing for asylum on gender-based grounds in particular, it's such a complex area of law that without a lawyer, it's very, to advise you in the beginning and also help you with your case, it's very hard to win your case. Mental health care and support, not only for the healing of the individual or the family, which we know is so incredibly important for trauma survivors, but also the asylum process demands a lot of interviewing. You have to create, declarations. You also, like written testimony, you also have to testify in person. And so having the support of a mental health care provider can be absolutely critical to be able to make your case. It also can help provide evidence in your case. Safe and sanitary living conditions, not only because we all deserve that, but also because, if a person is distracted from presenting their story by worrying about whether they are safe or whether they can provide a safe and clean environment for their child or themselves, or they're sick, it's very hard in those situations to effectively present your case for asylum. Obviously, evidence, witnesses, and documents can be very hard to glean when you're waiting in, as you saw in a picture, when you're waiting in a facility that doesn't have good access to phones, internet, to lawyers, and that type of thing. We don't know yet if court hearings are going to be telephonic, video conference, or in person, but as an attorney who has represented many, many asylum seekers and interviewed hundreds, I can promise you that it's hard to imagine a trauma survivor, a survivor of gender-based violence, being able to effectively make her case if she doesn't have access to these things. It's going to be very, very hard for her. Next slide, please. In addition to Remain in Mexico, we all have heard in the news of talk of this wall. The only reason to talk about it here, in addition to the fact that we all may have our own opinions about the wall and about whether it's a useful or necessary or even desired feature of our immigration policy, I think we're concerned in particular about what it might mean for survivors of violence who are trying to come to this country, in addition to Remain in Mexico and these other policies, which we hope will be litigated and we hope will be stopped and stalled. We are concerned that a physical wall could present similarly obstacles to survivors of violence who should truly have access under international and domestic law to protection here in the United States. Just to say that, many times when I've spoken with other advocates, with members, lawmakers, members of Congress, or members of the media, one thing I'm asked often is, what do I think about the wall, and do I think it will really be built? And What always sticks with me, and one of the talking points I often use, is that I'm very concerned that with or without the physical wall, the administration is really building a wall through its policies, as we've heard, and also combining that with a series of legal decisions that really amount to a wall that attempts to keep, in particular, survivors of violence, who make up the majority of Central Americans coming to this country, out and keep them from getting the protection that they're legally entitled to. I'm just going to move now very briefly into a few practical notes. And before I do that, because I always need to say this, nothing that I say here should be taken to be legal advice. Of course, every individual's case is different and will require different kinds of legal gymnastics, if you will. And so please don't take anything I say here as legal advice for your client or for you. I'm really just trying to help us all think together about how we can best support survivors of violence who are immigrants trying to figure out a path forward. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So really, the number one piece of advice one could give in this moment is that it's super important to consult attorneys who are working in this space. And so I say asylum attorneys, meaning immigration attorneys or immigration attorneys with expertise in asylum, because of how fast things are moving. And you heard the depth of information that Anne was able to share. Every one of those legal arguments that's being made in major national cases could have implications to advise for or against an application or to tell us how successful an application might be. And so definitely consult with attorneys who are trying to keep on top of this rapidly changing area. And I put national resources on that list of people you can contact as well. I want to be sure to plug also CGRS does have, does provide technical assistance, and you can reach out to them, and not only to track cases you actively have, but also to ask questions. We also, and our contact information is here toward the end. Tahrir Justice Center also has model briefs and other things we can share if you need them, if you're a lawyer progressing, or if your client or service seeker is working with an attorney and you're concerned the attorney doesn't have enough resources, feel free to invite that attorney to connect with us. There's also, at the end of this, you'll see how to get on the AIS list, and if you do that mailing list, and if you do that, we can also make sure that you have updates through our newsletter and in other ways to learn more about these issues. It's very hard right now with our clients. So Tahrir right now has, a few thousand active clients and hundreds who are applying for asylum, largely under the rubric of that we just learned about from Anne, of matter of AB and grace and the implications of these cases. And so we are constantly trying to apply this rapidly changing law to our clients' cases. And it's very hard for us, more and more hard for us, to make promises about timing and outcomes. And this has to do with a number of factors. Obviously, how likely is a client to be eligible as it relates to the outcome, but also when policies shift so dramatically. We've had clients waiting for years for their hearing and their decision, and had their case been heard years ago when they first applied, they would have been granted. But because of backlogs at the immigration court level or the Department of Homeland Security level, they've been waiting for years, and only now are they up for adjudication, which means these much harsher standards are being applied. So we can't really make promises about what the outcomes might be. That makes it harder for us to do our job as lawyers when it comes to working with our clients. Also, we have a difficulty making assurances about timing. As everyone knows, the federal government shutdown has had an incredible impact, a very negative impact on many of us in our personal lives and our professional lives, but also has had an impact on our clients, undoubtedly, also with regard to their cases, because the federal courts, including immigration courts, were not scheduling hearings. And so many clients who were scheduled to receive their decisions within the last few weeks have been put off indefinitely. So it's very hard, again, to make promises. So keep that in mind when you're working with asylum seekers, especially if you work in a shelter or if you're running a family law case. for a client, keep in mind that it's going to be very hard for your client to feel a sense of stability, or even possibly to answer your question. If you're asking her to tell you when is your case going to be resolved, what's going on with your lawyer, just be advised that it may be very hard for your client to get information out of her lawyer about what is coming down the pike for her. We definitely want any potentially eligible applicants to consider applying. One of the negative impacts of all the media, I would say, in the summer of last year about matter of AB, it has pros and cons. One of the positive impacts, of course, was that people learned about the issue and attention was drawn to it. But a negative impact is that sometimes the headlines read things that are inaccurate. So you heard Anne explain, actually there is room to apply for asylum, and the decision in matter of AB was not does not preclude people from winning. They may lose, but they're not precluded from winning, and that's very important for potential asylum applicants who are out in the community reading the newspaper, watching the news, to know. So if people are coming to you and saying, I heard women can no longer get asylum, or I heard Central Americans are no longer being given asylum, be sure to let them know that some of these generalizations are not true, that lawyers and activists and advocates and organizers across the country are working very hard to make sure that people can apply for asylum who would have deserved it just a year or two ago, and we're actively hoping that people will continue to apply so that we can assist in those cases and help them get the protection they need. There are obviously risks to applying and presenting yourself to the government, so that's another reason why I say consider applying and talk to a lawyer and not take this as blanket advice. Again, generally attending hearings is important in order to keep your case moving and to not get an order of removal against you. So again, if you're talking to a service seeker who says, I don't think I'm going to get asylum, I'm not going to my hearings anymore, it's a good idea for that individual to speak with an attorney who could assess the pros and cons of making that kind of a decision. And then with gender-based cases, again, it's really important that we're talking to folks. We ourselves, again, with our large caseload, are daily adjusting. Okay, let's go to the next slide, and we're just about done. We do want to invite you to contact us. My email is up here, Anne's is up here as well. We're, just a couple people in larger organizations, and we're all fighting very hard to protect gender-based asylum, and in fact to improve upon it and to work toward legislative, legal change over the next several years that will help clients like ours and clients like yours and all survivors of gender-based violence coming into the United States or being held in Mexico trying to make their claims. And we do look forward to partnering with you, and we really appreciate your solidarity in doing this work with us. Next slide. Making sure you know a few resources. Center for Gender and Refugee Studies general website is there. Ours is there as well. Human Rights First is a partner organization of ours that really focuses on asylum and refugee issues in the U.S. And although their primary focus is not on gender, because these issues have become very much at the heart of advocacy on asylum, they've become they are a very important partner in these issues, and we invite you to check out their materials, their fact sheets, especially on policy things like I was talking about at the beginning, such as asylum ban and the Remain in Mexico policy. There's some great stuff on their website. Invite you to check that out. And also the American Immigration Lawyers Association at AILA.org. They maintain lists of attorneys you can reach out to, as well as lists of policy briefs and statements made by various organizations. They keep it all as sort of a compendium on their site, and we invite you to check that out too when in doubt. And the last slide, Yane. So thank you so much for joining Anne and I, and also the rest of the Alliance for Immigrant Survivors for this webinar. We hope it's been informative to you. This is our website, immigrantsurvivors.org. You're welcome to come there to sign up for our listserv, to receive emails from us, or to ask us questions at info@immigrantsurvivors.org. Thank you again to Cecilia for setting up the webinar, and to Grace, Rosie, Cecilia, Yane, and Anne for all your work and participation in pulling this off. I'm watching the question box, and I don't see questions in it that we need to answer at the moment. So what I will do is go ahead and wrap up right now. We gift you back a few minutes of your day to get there out to the back to your work, and keep thinking about asylum seekers, and be in touch with us, please, if we can do anything to assist you. Thanks so much. Have a great afternoon.